Sir, namaskar. Welcome, sir.
Yes, good to see you. Very good to see you.
Thank you, sir. We have our Honorable Vice Chancellor and Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences who just joined in the meeting. So I extend heartiest welcome to them.
We are very honored by their presence.
I am saying the namaskar to Professor
Namaskar.
Chakravarti and,
Namaskar.
and welcome to this webinar. So definitely we all are eager to listen to you.
Professor Kishore Kumar Chakravarti, who was a distinguished professor of philosophy and religion in Davis and Elkinson College, West Virginia, is at present the president of Institute for Cross-Cultural Studies and Academic Exchange. To inform our audience, Professor Kishore Kumar Chakravarti has authored several landmark books which are being used as textbook in different universities of abroad. For example, Classical Indian Philosophy of Mind, the Nyaya Dualist Tradition, then Definition and Induction, that is another very interesting book, and then Logic of Gautama, then Towards Dualism, and many more such works. Professor Chakravarti is one of the widely published philosophers from India, and if you wish, you can just refer to different works which are appeared in Philosophy East and West, one of the leading journals of philosophy, then Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, International Philosophical Quarterly, Journal of Indian Philosophy, and he himself is the editor of a journal named Journal of Indian Philosophy and Religion. With this brief introduction, I wish to inform the audience that this lecture is going to be the inaugural lecture of ICPR Study Circle meetings at SMBDU. ICPR Study Circle meetings are organized through different institutions by the Indian Council of Philosophical Research and Sri Mata Vaishno Devi University, the School of Philosophy and Culture here is selected for this year, 21 and 22, to organize ICPR lecture. So this is the inaugural lecture. I am really grateful to Professor Kishore Chakravarti that he agreed to be part of this study circle and be the first professor to deliver a lecture. And study circle is going to have monthly lecture. So I wish that all of you who are connected today or who may be connecting afterwards, please keep yourself updated. I will be mailing you all regarding the other lectures. So here I welcome Professor Kishore Chakravarti for this inaugural lecture. The title of the lecture is Epistemic and Spiritual Empowerment of People through the Conceptual Resources of Indian Philosophy. And he will be drawing largely from the Nyaya philosophy, being a Nyaya scholar, and he has a very good access to all other traditions. We have learned from none other than Professor Kishore Chakravarti that if we read any system of Indian philosophy, we are going to be familiar with other systems because the dialogue or the exchange between different systems is so fine and so intimate that it is not possible to understand one system in exclusion to other systems. But of course, for the sake of managing scholarly and academic writing, one has to focus on something because of our limited capacity. So I welcome on this occasion Professor Kishore Kumar Chakravarti to guide us on this very theme. The idea behind this theme is that the common population must be familiar with the philosophical resources available in the tradition. And once they are familiar, so I argue with my students that the logical component which we draw from any source, unless we intend to do bad logic, we are going to naturally formulate good arguments. So with that objective, we call it a kind of epistemic empowerment by familiarizing the audience with the resources, logical resources available in the Indian tradition. And then if we are too much into logicality, then of course something must be missing. And therefore we wish to have a kind of transformation from logicality to what we call spirituality. So the discourses which are supposed to be conducted through the study circle meeting from our School of Philosophy and Culture at Sri Masta Vaishno Devi University is supposed to not just logically or epistemically empower the people, but also lead them to think about spiritual transformation. So these talks are certainly going to be beneficial for the development of intellectual competence, as well as transforming the very personality and developing more of human elements in the consciousness. I have personal perspective on this, that when we grow, so it's not that we are growing human consciousness. In fact, it is consciousness which generates more humanity, and we may call that a growing human consciousness in our personality, but it's a kind of consciousness which is going to embrace more and more humanity or elements from humanity as such. So I invite Professor Kishore Chakravarti to enlighten our audience and guide us to conduct the further meetings also through his delivery today. So Professor Chakravarti, you are most welcome. Kindly take over.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, part of this August occasion, and I'm sure that the future meetings organized by you will also be very productive and fruitful. Of course, it's absolutely important that a philosophy program and a program of philosophy and culture engages in such activities. That is, especially in Indian philosophy, knowledge is always considered to be the necessary means for spiritual progress. And spiritual progress is inseparable from moral progress, from the viewpoint of all the schools, all the major schools of Indian philosophy. Indian philosophy is so vast, it is going to be very superficial if I try to cover too many different areas and schools of Indian philosophy. So instead of doing that, I'm going to focus on only one particular school of Indian philosophy and their viewpoint on epistemic empowerment and spiritual empowerment, and the bridge between the two, between epistemic empowerment and spiritual empowerment, is moral empowerment. So that is a Nyaya position, and so I'm going to speak on that. In other words, I'm going to speak on the Nyaya viewpoint of epistemic empowerment, moral empowerment, and spiritual empowerment. In the Nyaya viewpoint, they are indispensable. In order to have moral empowerment, you must have epistemic empowerment. And in order to have spiritual empowerment, you must have moral empowerment as well as epistemic empowerment. So from the earliest times, the Nyaya school has taken that position. And this position is not just unique to Indian philosophy, I would like to say. There are great Western philosophers. Probably, they were also influenced by Indian philosophy. There is much evidence of such contact and influence. Since time is short, I'm not going to get into that, but I will mention a couple of great Western philosophers who probably were influenced by Indian philosophy in the light of the very, very substantial evidence we have. And they are Plato and Aristotle. The great Greek philosophers, Clearly, in Plato's view, he has argued for this view in many dialogues, including the Meno, for example, one of his famous dialogues, that virtue is knowledge. So the road to moral and spiritual progress is through knowledge in Plato's view. He was a supporter of what we may call in the Indian philosophical context, Jnana Marga, which of course is a very highly developed viewpoint in many of the Upanishadic writings. And it is quite probable that those Upanishadic writings were known to, because of the high level of contact between the Greeks and the Persians and the Indians at that time, were known to the great Greek philosophers, the Jnana Marga approach. And so Plato took this position very clearly that a good life has to be a life of reason. A good life has to be a thoughtful life. And that is also Aristotle's view, who was a direct student of Plato, no surprise there. And for him, a moral choice has to be a rational choice. And so I don't wish to spend more time on these great Greek philosophers. I just want to say that the viewpoint that I'm going to talk about, based on the Nyaya perspective, is not unique by any means to Indian philosophy. Probably due to the influence of Indian philosophers on the Greek philosophers, the great Greek philosophers also support many of the ideas that I'm going to talk about now. So Nyaya Darshana, or Nyaya philosophy, is one of the 6 orthodox systems of Hindu philosophy. Though the main focus of the Nyaya is on logic and epistemology, and to a lesser extent on ontology, it also contains a theory of what we should do, or what for us is the right thing to do, and a theory of why we should do it, and what is good, based most importantly on study of the true nature of the self, Atma Tattva Jnana. This may be called Nyaya ethics and the Nyaya path of moral empowerment and spiritual empowerment. Our brief account of Nyaya epistemic, moral, and spiritual empowerment is directly based on the original Sanskrit sources and touches on both viewpoints, often treated cursorily in modern studies, that Nyaya shares in some ways with many other Indian philosophical schools, and those that are distinctive of Nyaya. We first turn to the Nyaya Sutra, the founding work of the Nyaya school, and the oldest available commentary called the Nyaya Bhashya. According to Nyaya Sutra 1.1.1, through awareness of 16 topics, like sources of knowing, the knowables, doubt, purpose, the steps of demonstration, the pseudo-probantia, and so on, leads to the highest good. Nyaya Sutra 1.1.9 gives a list of 12 knowables, namely the self, the body, the external sense organs, the objects, that is, objects of voluntary action, mainly pleasure, pain, artha, pleasure, pain, and their causal conditions, cognitive states, buddhi, the inner sense, manas, volition, prayatna, failings, dosha, rebirth, pritya bhava, fruits of voluntary actions, phala, suffering, dukkha, and liberation, apavarga. Nyaya Bhashya on that glosses that true awareness of the knowables, beginning with the self, leads to the highest good. and moral and spiritual empowerment. Thus, though knowledge of all 16 topics listed in the first sutra, first Nyaya Sutra, is useful for the highest good, knowledge of the knowables such as the self, the body, volition, failings, and so on are directly relevant for the highest good and moral and spiritual empowerment. Of the knowables again, the self is the most important. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Please carry on. Yes, sir.
Okay. Of the knowables again, the self is the most important, and it is knowledge of the self that is the most directly relevant for the highest good and moral and spiritual empowerment, though knowledge of all knowables and indirectly of all 16 topics is useful for that purpose. So many schools of Indian philosophy emphasize the role of knowledge for moral and spiritual progress. But the distinctive part of Nyaya is the epistemic, is the epistemic area, the way it has laid down the epistemic area. Just look at the topics. Pramana, for moral and spiritual progress, for moral and spiritual empowerment, we need to learn about the sources of knowing, the pramanas, the prameyas, sanshaya, doubt, prayojana, right? Drishtanta, siddhanta, avayava, the demonstrative steps, tarka, indirect style of reasoning, and so on and so on. Vitanda, chala, jati, nigrahasthana, all of these are very, very important for logical purposes, right? Vitanda, chala, jati, nigrahasthana, etvabhasa, what kind of mistakes are to be avoided when we are arguing for something. Now, why do the Nyaya philosophers take this position? What I want to say is that other schools of Indian philosophy also agree with Nyaya on the point that knowledge is necessary for moral and spiritual progress. The distinctive part of Nyaya is that they take the requirement of knowledge to a very high level and include such logical topics as fallacies. You have to be well-grounded in all the sources of knowing, perception, inference, authority, and so on. Learn how to avoid mistakes in arguing, and so on. This is distinctively the Nyaya viewpoint. Not that the other schools of Indian philosophy are ignorant of this or are opposed to this, but the Nyaya emphasizes on this to a great extent. Why do they do that? This is because of the basic viewpoint of Nyaya that the chief obstacle and impediment to moral and spiritual progress and empowerment of the people comes from false knowledge, mithya jnana. And false knowledge of many things, but especially false knowledge of what they regard as mukhya prameya, namely the Atman or the self. False knowledge of the self. What is typical false knowledge of the self? It is wrong identification of the self with what is not the self. So how do we do that in common parlance in our everyday life? It's very easy to see that. Very commonly, we say things like, I am fat, or, I am deaf, etc., etc. Now just pay attention to what I'm saying. When I'm saying I am fat, I'm attributing a property of the body to me, which implies that I am identifying myself with my body, which in the Nyaya perspective is wrong and is the main reason why we falter, we fall back in the path of moral and spiritual empowerment. The wrong identification of the self with the body leads to all kinds of failings, many, many failings that we have, such as greed for more possessions, such as anger, such as lust, sexual promiscuity. It is very easy to see that if we strongly separate the self from the body, we shall be reluctant to fall victim to such failings as greed, as lust, and so on. They are clearly grounded in the body. So this wrong identification of the self with the body in the Nyaya view is a serious obstacle. It makes us selfish, it makes us egoistic, and prevents us from leading a moral and spiritual life. But knowledge of the self is not easy to achieve in the Nyaya view. For these early Nyaya philosophers, the self is not perceived. It can only be inferred from certain signs, such as pleasure, pain, and so on. The Nyaya Sutra 1.1.9 lays down some signs, inferential marks, with the help of which the self can be inferred, such as pleasure, pain, and so on. And that is why, since our knowledge of the self in the view of the early Nyaya philosophers has to be grounded not on perception, but on inference, and knowledge of the self is absolutely necessary for moral and spiritual empowerment, that is why there is so much focus in Nyaya philosophy on topics like, avayava, the demonstrative steps, tarka, indirect reasoning, hettvabhasa, fallacies, because otherwise we are likely to go astray. We are likely to make too many mistakes and fall behind instead of making progress. So that is the distinctive viewpoint of Nyaya when it comes to epistemic empowerment. Their emphasis on, a lot of emphasis on the sources of knowing, including especially anumana or inference, because that is indispensable for knowledge of the self. That is the main point. Inference is indispensable for knowledge of the self, and without that we cannot make moral and spiritual progress. So the highest good is liberation, apavarga. And what is that? According to Nyaya Sutra 1.1.22, liberation is the absolute relief from that. So what is that? Since the immediately previous aphorism is devoted to suffering, Nyaya Bhashya takes that to stand for suffering. So liberation in the Nyaya view is absolute relief from suffering. And this is the highest good and the highest stage of moral and spiritual empowerment. There is absolute relief from suffering. Similar ideas are voiced in what is often regarded as the sister philosophical school called the Vaisheshika. The Vaisheshika Sutra, the founding work of that school of philosophy, begins by proclaiming that dharma will be explained. Vaisheshika Sutra 1.1.1. The word dharma, that means what holds or supports, literally, is sometimes used in a very general sense, like the English word thing. It is also often used to mean righteousness. Since the Vaisheshika Sutra proceeds to develop an ontology of all that exists and also gives an account of righteousness, both senses of dharma are intended in the above aphorism. In particular, the next aphorism, Vaisheshika Sutra 1.1.2, says that dharma is that through which there is progress and accomplishment of the highest good. The commentary called Upaskara of the 16th century of the Common Era explains that awareness of the truth is progress, absolute cessation of suffering is the highest good, and the dharma is that through which both come. Progress or awareness of truth is the gateway to the highest good. The Padartha Dharma Sangraha, the second most influential work of the Vaisheshika school, says that true awareness of similarities and differences of the 6 categories of substance, quality particular, motion, universal, ultimate differentiator, and inherence is the causal condition of the highest good. Again, the emphasis on knowledge. This early Vaisheshika work mentions God in many places. and emphasizes the importance of generally binding samanya dharmas, obligations, like non-violence, caregiving, truthfulness, and so on, and other observances and restraints, yamas and niyamas, as well as true awareness for achieving the